Today we're going to talk about novel length and the importance of not rushing or overdoing the plot. Now that being said, a lot of these are semi-arbitrary line lengths. Now the reason I say semi-arbitrary is because these are good goals to aim for if you don't want to rush your plot. If you don't want to rush your plot, generally these word counts are good goals to aim for. However, there will be exceptions, and I'll talk about all the different exceptions to the rules, but that's why I say semi-arbitrary, is because there have been books that have been over or under that word count that have been published and have done well. It's not about that. Especially when you're traditionally publishing and independently publishing, there is a certain expectation of word count because it's just easy to underwrite or easy to overwrite when you go over or under the word count for a certain age range. Now, when I say underwriting, I mean not giving enough detail, skipping important scenes, things like that. And when I say overwriting, I mean writing in scenes that aren't really necessary, writing in characters that aren't really necessary, overcomplicating the plot when you could simplify it down and make it actually more rich of story because you don't have so many moving parts that you have to keep track of, things like that. I'm going to get more in depth as we go on. Okay, the first one we're going to talk about is junior fiction, specifically lower middle grade, because they actually are different for lower and upper middle grade. If you're going for lower middle grade, that's going to be more in your 4th grade through 7th grade, sometimes 8th grade, but that's generally considered upper middle grade. With 4th grade to more like 6th or 7th grade, what you're going to aim for is 20,000 to 55,000 words. 55,000 is like the absolute maximum you can do for a lower middle grade novel. Same thing with upper middle grade novel, actually. 55,000 is generally, if you're doing a middle grade novel, upper or lower, the absolute maximum that you can do. However, when you're doing a lower middle grade novel, you're going to probably want to lean more towards 20,000 just because attention spans are short at that age. They want to go run out and play rather than read a novel. Generally, they're reading novels not because they want to, but because their parents are like, you have to learn how to read. And so I'm making you read chapter books because you've learned how to read, but now you have to practice. Whereas upper middle grade, they might actually be genuinely reading for fun at this point. That's when you get into 40,000 to 55,000. This is important because the plot complexity gets a lot more thick at this age, where as in lower middle grade, it might be, we have to go get this special magic book before the end of the book or else, or we have to go rescue this fairy, or something like that. Like the plot is very one goal, simple, I am who I am, there's no complexity to me. It's pretty flat characters, pretty simple goals. Whereas upper middle grade, you start getting more complex characters, you start getting more complex plots, you start getting betrayal and action and intrigue, and it starts getting a lot more, there's no way you could fit it in less than 40,000 words without underwriting. Now, it is possible, it's just not likely. That's part of the reason why traditional publishers will ask you for your word count. Because if your word count is above a certain number, they generally are like, oh, there might have to be some deleting going on. And if it's under a certain number, they're generally going to be like, okay, underwriting, maybe they missed a few scenes, maybe they're not considering the complexity of the plot, maybe it needs to be rearranged for the age range, maybe it's not quite appropriate for the age range. It might need to be lowered if it's a lower word count, it might need to be moved up if it's a higher word count. Then the next range. Okay. Young adult. Junior fiction's generally a pretty sliding scale. That's why I only had the 2. However, with YA, there is a huge range. So, with this being said, below 40,000 is too short for YA. Period. I'm sorry, I've read ones that are below 40,000, and unless it's considered a novella, too short for YA. There's no way you can write a complex young adult novel plot without underwriting if it is under 40,000 words. It's just too short. You're missing scenes that are vital to the plot. You're missing character development. You're missing detail that is desperately needed. Again, there are exceptions to this rule, but they're few and far between. I absolutely, if you have an example, would love to see an example of one that's under 40,000 words that is successfully done, young adult novel. All right, next is the general zone that you want to aim for is 50,000 to 75,000. Generally, if you have that as your word count, somewhere in there, and you're trying to query a young adult novel, they're like, all right, you hit it pretty spot on. However, if you hit into the 80,000 to 90,000 word range, they're a little more skeptical. You're generally safe, but they might read over it and be like, are they overwriting anywhere? Are they having superfluous scenes? Just because they're looking for ways to cut it down if necessary. Doesn't always need it, but if necessary. The plot complexity might require 80,000 to 90,000 words, but not always. All right. Now, if you hit 45,000 to 48,000, they might be a little bit worried about underwriting, but they're a little bit more like, maybe we'll just buff it up a little bit with detail. It's not terribly it's not that bad. Whereas then you start getting into 100,000, it might be too long for a YA novel if you get into 100,000 words, and 110,000 words and above is generally considered way too long for young adult, unless it is an epic fantasy novel. Epic fantasy novels and sci-fi are the exception here, and that is because of the fact that there's so much complexity of world building going on that there's no way that you can, with epic fantasy, fully encapsulate in 50,000 words or less. By all means, if you can, go for it. But generally, reaching towards 100,000 words or more tends to happen more with science fiction and epic fantasy, and that's okay. But that is really the only exception. If you're writing a 100,000 word long YA romance novel, you're probably overwriting. Probably some scenes you could cut there. With adult word count goals, 80,000 to 90,000 is generally like what you want to aim for with adult novels, irregardless of genre. Then again, 90,000 to 100,000 is generally safe. They might start looking at, hey, you might be overwriting. 90,000 is one of those ones where it's like somewhere between totally cool and generally safe because it depends on the publisher. That's why I have it in both categories. It's the high end of the totally cool category and the low end of the generally safe category. But once you start hitting 100,000, you're generally safe with adult novels, but they might ask you to do some trimming and might ask you to do some slimming down. If you're doing 70,000 to 80,000, it might be too short, but it also might be okay. It depends on what you're doing. And the reason I said 70,000 to 80,000 is, again, because these are ranges. So 80,000 is the high range of might be too short, but 70,000 is the low range of might be too short. That's when they might look at, you might be underwriting. 100,000 to 110,000 might be too long, but it does depend on the genre. If you're doing 110,000 or more and it's epic fantasy, perfectly acceptable. If you're doing 110,000 or above, though, in any category except epic fantasy and sci-fi, it will generally be considered too long, and they may not even look at it just because they're like, oh, you're an overwriter and it's going to take way too much deleting. I don't have the time for that, especially at bigger publishing companies. Smaller publishing companies might be more willing to read it and go over it and delete stuff, but bigger publishing companies are going to look at that, and if it's not an epic fantasy or science fiction novel and it's a romance novel that's 120,000 words, you're going to be looking at a problem. If it's epic fantasy, however, that's generally within the expectation. All right, last one that I'm going to talk about is the other categories with adult and YA, that being novella, novelette, and short story. So a novelette is basically a super long short story. It's anywhere from 7,700 words to 17,000 words. Now, this being said, like I said, it's a longer short story. It helps you to expand on the short story while still keeping it cut down and encapsulated to the point. It's a pretty simple plot generally. However, you're still able to expand the plot a little bit. A novella, now this is the tricky part. A novella is either, I'm just gonna say this. A novella is either a terribly underwritten novel or it's a fantastic shorter story. Now with a shorter story, it's basically just You have a complex plot, you have a movement, you have complex characters, but their story just isn't going to last that long. It may take place over, 4 months, 5 months, or something like that. If it takes place over 3 years, it's not going to be a novella. You're generally underwriting. And that is generally 17,500 to 40,000 words. Again, if it's 40,000 and below, it's generally a novella, it's not a novel, you're probably underwriting. But that's okay. That's why we have editors. And it's okay if you're an underwriter. I actually find that it's far easier to fix underwriting than it is overwriting, because overwriting you have to decide what's important and what's not and cut it. Whereas with underwriting, all you can do is add. It can only get better from there with adding detail and adding scenes. So if I had to pick as an editor which one I prefer, I always would choose an underwriter over an overwriter. And I think traditional publishers would say the same. The one I worked for, I know would say the same, but then again, I don't know about other traditional publishers. Generally, underwriting is better than overwriting. However, severe underwriting is a problem. So for example, if you have a 30,000 word novel that you're trying to query in a young adult genre and you're saying it's a novel, not a novella, that's probably going to be a problem. However, if you're saying, hey, it's a 48,000 word novel and it's YA, that could use a little buffing, but not a big deal. Traditional publishers would probably look at that and be like, yeah, we can buff this up. Like, it feels like an easier project than trying to snip all that stuff out, because you have to still read all of that and then you have to decide what you want to get rid of. Whereas with underwriting, you are just like, oh, add this scene, I really want to see this scene, and different things like that. It helps expand on the story and it makes it easier for the editor because they're telling you to add more rather than them deciding what to cut. So it actually gives less work for them, and it's better for you and them in the long run, in my opinion. Again, this is my opinion for underwriting and overwriting. These are also, all the numbers that I'm quoting though are from statistical averages from traditional publishing companies. So these are actual quotations of traditional publishing company averages. I'm just saying that for me, underwriting is preferred. That's an opinion though, to clarify. All right. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is short stories. Short stories for adult and YA are generally less than 7,500 words. If you start getting more than 7,500 words, it is no longer considered a short story. It's considered a novelette. And if it is going above 17,000, then it is considered a novella. That being said, I think the biggest thing is just, if you're writing a story, any story, and you want to query it with a traditional publisher, check what your genre is and what the age group is, because that will help give you an average that will know what to aim for and what the traditional publishing companies are looking for. These averages that I just listed are absolutely essential for knowing what traditional publishing companies are looking for, and it's going to help you be more likely to have them look at it the closer you are to these word count ranges. And the same thing with independently published novels too. We have grown up in a society where traditionally published is what we know. As a result of that, our expectation is that you don't underwrite and you don't overwrite. You write the exact right amount for your story. As a result of that, unfortunately for independently published authors, if you underwrite, you tend to get people who are kind of like, oh, I wish there was more, I'm kind of sad, there's plot holes, there's character flaws that haven't been fully developed. There's a lot of problems with underwriting. However, sometimes it can just be a detail thing. There's a lot of people I work with who it's just like, oh, well, you just need a scene to expand on this relationship, or I feel like you would have benefited from having a fight scene with the dragon instead of just skipping over the dragon fight scene, and different things like that. I feel like you were building up towards it and then we missed it and things like that. That's more what underwriting advice is, whereas overwriting advice, traditional publishing companies tend to be like, you are just crazy with your world building. And again, if you're epic fantasy or science fiction, you're golden. But if you're in romance or mystery or any of the others, you're generally going to want to make sure that you hit more of the low end and then have them ask you to add more rather than asking to cut. Asking to cut stuff from your novel is going to be far harder. on their end, and people are more discouraged to do that. All right. If you guys have any questions about novel length and traditional publishing, please let me know in the comments below. Or if you have any recommendations of novels that are in the adult or YA or upper middle grade or lower middle grade sections that are below or above these word count averages that you think did a fabulous job, please let me know. I'm very curious to see anything that is more specific on these types of things and like not having exact word counts, because I believe that you don't necessarily have to hit these averages. I just think that these are good guiding points. And for traditional publishing companies, they are generally a goal that they will ask you to try and lean towards. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great evening. Please remember that the writing competition, all of the stuff for the adult writing competition for this summer is due on this Thursday, the 20th, before 8:45 p.m. Not a minute later. I've told all my coworkers, so if they're saying not a minute later, that's not my fault. That's not their fault. It is my fault. That's what I'm trying to say. They're not being mean. It's because I told them, because we need to shut down the library by 9. So as a result, I cannot take any after 8:45. That way we have the ability to still close up on time. That being said, if you think you're not going to make it because there's like an emergency or a 4-car pileup or something like that, and you're like, I was going to make it on time and now I'm not, call the library. If you call the library before 8:45 p.m. and tell us when to expect you, I will allow it. But only if you call before 8:45 p.m. I will consider that as it having been turned in, and you can turn it in late. However, when I say turn it in late, I mean the day after if we're already closed, or after 8:45 p.m. but before 9. That's it. That's the only exception. I will not take it 5 days after. I will not take it 2 days after. It's either the immediate day after or before 9 p.m. on Thursday. My brain just had a short circuit there. All right, and then don't forget that next Saturday on the 29th, we are having an all-day writers conference from 10:30 a.m. to 6 o'clock p.m. I am super excited to do this with you guys. We have so many great authors, including our USA Today bestseller, Allie Cross, and we also have Natalie Bruyan and Arlem Hawks, who is a fantastic Regency romance author, and honestly, I can't even remember all their names because they're all just so fabulous. There's too many to recall. Please look at our website if you want to see the full list, and thank you so much. Please attend. Bye.